morning, Rep Fox. Can I please have you count to 10?
Who are you asking to count to 10?
I'm asking you, Mrs. Fox. Can you
Okay,
please
thank
give me
you.
10? Yeah, of course.
Yes, ma'am. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Sounds perfect. Thank you so much. You can go
Thank
ahead.
you. Thank you.
As somebody who works in broadcast, I think I wish I need to take this with me. They won't. Is this our party gift? What's that? I think this is when we shut. What's the expiration date?
Good morning, Rep Kelly. Can I please have you unmute for a quick 10 count?
1, 2, 3, 4, 7.
Can I have that one more time? It cut off at the end.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9.
It keeps breaking up. Are you connected to the Wi-Fi?
Welcome everybody to today's hybrid roundtable. Some members will appear in person and others will appear remotely via Zoom. This roundtable will be slightly different from a committee hearing in that members will only get 3 minutes each for questions. We're doing this because this is only a preliminary step in our investigation, and it is not a full-scale examination of the issues. Most importantly, we want to keep the focus on the roundtable participants today who have powerful stories to tell. So I appreciate everyone's indulgence. And of course, at any future full committee hearing on this topic, members will get the normal 5 minutes for questions. Members who are appearing remotely, who are not recognized, should remain muted to minimize background noise and feedback. If you want to be recognized outside of regular order, you may identify that in several ways. You may use the chat function to send a request. You may send an email to the majority staff, or you may unmute your mic to seek recognition. You will begin the roundtable. We will begin in just a few moments when they tell me that they are ready to begin the live stream. The committee will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Waiting for the noise to end. I'm in New York. Welcome, everyone. Today we are examining a serious issue with a goal that I hope all of us can agree on. The need to finally end sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace. Just yesterday, Mr. Snyder sought to rebrand his team as the Commanders. With due respect, it's going to take more than a name change to fix that broken culture. In this roundtable, I need to finally end sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace. Just yesterday, Mr. Snyder sought to rebrand his team as the Commanders. With due respect, it's going to take more than a name change to fix that broken culture. In this roundtable, I hope to learn who was the commander of seeking non-disclosure agreements after women were harassed. Who was the commander of taking secret videos of women? Who was the commander of ensuring the Wilkinson report stayed secret? We should be able to agree on the fact that sexual harassment will not stop and workplaces like the Washington Commanders will not improve unabated. Recent events have laid bare how much remains to be done to protect people from sexual harassment in the workplace. In 1964, Congress passed Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which banned sex discrimination in the workplace. But nearly 3 decades later, the Me Too movement exposed that sexual harassment in the workplace is still occurring and that many victims go years without justice or accountability. Powerful men like Harvey passed Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which banned sex discrimination in the workplace. But nearly 3 decades later, the Me Too movement exposed that sexual harassment in the workplace is still occurring and that many victims go years without justice or accountability. Powerful men like Harvey Weinstein and even former President Trump have used non-disclosure agreements to conceal their sexual misconduct and buy victim silence. Many large employers have done the same to cover up sexual harassment and other illegal workplace abuse. According to the National Women's Law Center, more than 1/3 of American workers are bound by some form of non-disclosure agreement. It is time for Congress to empower victims and make it harder for serial harassers to hide. Today, we will hear from 6 courageous people who decided to speak out about the toxic work environment they experienced at their former employer, the Washington football team. We will hear firsthand accounts of how for nearly 2 decades, under the leadership of team owner Daniel Snyder, women were touched inappropriately, degraded based on their appearance, and verbally abused on a near daily basis. We will hear that some of this abuse involved senior executives at the team. And we will hear how women suffered in silence because they feared retaliation or were bound by confidentiality agreements. And because of the Washington football team and the NFL failed to create procedures to safely report these incidents. Were it not for the courage of these brave individuals in coming forward to tell their stories, this outrageous conduct might still be a secret today, and many more people could be put at risk. Ultimately, there must be accountability for these actions. Back in 2014, when an NFL player was caught on video physically abusing his fiancée, the league's commissioner, Roger Goodell, said, and I quote, "The NFL is held to a higher standard and properly so," end quote, given the league's prominent role in American society. The league refused to release a written report and let Mr. Snyder off with a fine and a slap on the wrist. That is why this committee, in partnership with Chairman Krishnamurthy and the Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy, launched our investigation. As one of the most prominent workplaces in America, the NFL's attempt to cover up this conduct and avoid accountability sets a dangerous precedent for workplaces across the country. The committee has requested documents from the NFL so that we can finally learn the truth about what happened and why the NFL tried so hard to cover it up. But so far, we have been met with delays and finger pointing. I strongly urge the NFL to end its cover-up, fully cooperate with Congress, and immediately release the findings of their internal investigation. Even if the NFL refuses to act, it is my sincere hope the Washington football team will commit to stop using tactics like non-disclosure agreements, now and forever, to silence employees and conceal workplace misconduct. That is why this committee is exploring legislative solutions to rein in the use of non-disclosure agreements that prevent workers from speaking out about sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. We are also examining ways to promote accountability and strengthen protections for all workers. I now yield to my friend, Ranking Member Comer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Americans across our nation are facing multiple crises today because of the Biden administration policies. Inflation is at a 40-year high. We're experiencing the worst border crisis in our nation's history. Energy prices are surging. China has yet to be held accountable for covering up and unleashing COVID-19 on the world. Our adversaries are emboldened because of President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And as my colleague, Congressman Donalds, pointed out in a letter he sent last night, historic black colleges and universities face numerous bomb threats this week. Yet Democrats on this committee continue to ignore these and other crises that are impacting Americans' everyday lives. Instead of adhering to our committee's mission to root out waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement in the federal government, Democrats instead are holding a roundtable about the work culture in one single private organization. Make no mistake, no one should face harassment at work, and bad actors must be held accountable. But it's unclear why examining harassment that took place a decade ago in one private workplace warrants oversight from this committee. This issue is best handled by human resources and the courts, not Congress. Further, because of the bravery of the women testifying before us today, the culture of the franchise has completely turned around. And I want to thank the ladies for being here today. After the NFL's investigation into the football team last year, Commissioner Roger Goodell levied the highest fine on an owner in the history of the sport and suspended the owner from team's operations indefinitely. In addition, the commissioner made a series of recommendations to the team to improve its culture. This week, an independent audit confirmed those recommendations are working. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit the audit for the record. If that's okay. The audit
Without
found...
objection.
Okay, thank you. The audit found the Washington Redskins culture, leadership, human resources, practices, diversity, and morale all have improved. In fact, the audit noted 80% of team employees strongly agreed they had witnessed, quote, positive improvements in the team's culture of the past year. Recommendations are working. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit the audit for the record. If that's okay. The audit
Without
found...
objection.
Okay, thank you. The audit found the Washington Redskins culture, leadership, human resources, practices, diversity, and morale all have improved. In fact, the audit noted 80% of team employees strongly agreed they had witnessed, quote, positive improvements in the team's culture of the past year, unquote. Because of the commissioner's leadership, bad actors have been held accountable and the culture at the football team has improved. So why are Democrats utilizing committee resources today to examine an issue that is on the path to resolution and is outside this committee's jurisdiction? This committee under Democrat leadership is failing the American people. It's past time for this committee to get back to its mission and hold the Biden administration accountable for the many self-inflicted crises that are hurting everyday Americans. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The chair recognizes herself. I must say that President Biden has created 6 million jobs. He's cut child poverty in half. Later today in New York, where I am, because he's in New York with meetings with elected and community leaders and safety leaders, he's meeting on the safety in our schools, the safety of our streets, and ways to get guns off, illegal guns off the streets. So he has a record. He's working hard every day to help the American people. And I'm somewhat surprised that my colleague and friend on the other side of the aisle thinks that looking into a workplace misconduct in one of the most prominent workplaces in the entire country that sets a precedent, a leadership position, should not be looked at, discussed, and look at ways to stop it, not only at the Washington Football League, but at every workplace across America. And we are looking at remedies, legislation, and other ways to protect workers in the workplace. I feel it's extremely important. I yield back, and I now recognize my colleague in this, my co-chair on this, Chairman Krishnamurthy, who is the chairman of the Economic and Consumer Policy Subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Thank you so much. Good morning. And thank you to all the brave witnesses and participants today. I want to say especially thank you for exposing yourselves and coming here at great personal risk to ensure that the truth comes out about the NFL and the Washington football team, now known as the Washington Commanders. Sexual harassment is a serious problem. According to a Pew Research study, nearly 60% of women have been sexually harassed, and 40% of women have been harassed at work. Many victims fear reporting harassment. In fact, around 90% of victims never file a formal complaint. Why? Because they fear retaliation. That comes as no surprise, since nearly 75% of those who file complaints do face retaliation. Sexual harassment is a dangerous cycle. Perpetrators harass, victims who report are ignored, silenced, or retaliated against, and then the perpetrators get away with their misconduct and they repeat it again and again and again. We are here today to help break this cycle. That's why the chairwoman and I launched our investigation into sexual harassment at WFT, the Washington football team, and the NFL's mishandling of it. The WFT and the NFL, among the most prominent workplaces in America, should be setting a higher standard for others, not avoiding accountability and not covering up sexual harassment. In fact, the NFL previously embraced this role of adopting higher standards for itself. In 2014, in the wake of the Ray Rice domestic violence scandal, Commissioner Roger Goodell said the NFL is, quote, held to a higher standard and properly so. But behind the scenes, neither the WFT nor the NFL was holding itself to this higher standard. We'll hear painful stories from our victims about the severe, pervasive sexual harassment they experienced spanning almost 2 decades. We'll hear how the harassment wasn't limited to 1 or 2 harassers or even 1 or 2 victims. It spanned the entire organization. And that rot started at the top with team owner Daniel Snyder, and it trickled down. Mr. Snyder claimed in response to media reports of the harassment that he was, quote, unaware of these allegations and was simply, quote, hands off as an owner, close quote. As we'll hear today, unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. And Mr. Goodell has engaged in troubling behavior as well. As I said, Goodell claimed in 2014 to embrace a, quote, higher standard for the NFL, but in 2018, he failed to implement recommendations from a sexual harassment investigation of the Carolina Panthers. Those recommendations, if implemented, could have protected today's victims. The NFL had a playbook to fight sexual harassment. It just didn't use it. But Goodell didn't just fail to implement those recommendations. The NFL deep-sixed the findings from its own investigation into the Washington football team. Mr. Goodell and Mr. Snyder worked together to make sure the public never heard the full story, until now. Fortunately, the victims before us have been brave enough to speak out. Speaking out shouldn't be their burden. They should not have to retell day after day the stories of their trauma. But unfortunately, that's where we've wound up, thanks to the NFL's apparent cover-up. After we hear from these victims, we'll all be clear on one thing: to ensure real accountability and to stop workplace harassment in the future, the NFL and WFT must release the findings of its own investigation. This is the beginning, not the end, of holding the rich and powerful accountable and protecting women across America from workplace sexual harassment. Recognizing the NFL's power and popularity, Roger Goodell once said that we should hold the NFL to a higher standard. And starting with today's roundtable, we will. I yield back, Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back. I would like to introduce the participants and thank them in our roundtable today. Our first participant is Melanie Coburn, who was a cheerleader for the Washington football team from 1997 to 2001, and was the Director of Marketing and Marketing Coordinator from 2001 to 2011. Then we will hear from Tiffany Johnston, who was a cheerleader for the Washington football team from 2007 to 2008, and a marketing manager and marketing and events coordinator for club level tickets from 2002 to 2008. Next, we will hear from Brad Baker, who was a producer at the Washington football team from 2007 to 2008, and a video production manager from 2008 to 2009. Next, we will hear from Anna Nunez, who was a coordinator of business development and client service and an account executive at the Washington football team from 2015 to 2019. Next, we will hear from Rachel Eagleson, who started as an intern for the Washington football team in 2010, and then became a customer service representative, a manager of premium client services, the director of marketing and client relations, and the director of client services from 2011 to 2019. Finally, we will hear from Emily Applegate, who was a marketing coordinator, premium client services coordinator, and ticket sales representative at the Washington football team from 2014 to 2015. Thanks to all of you for appearing today. And with that, you are now recognized for your statement, Ms. Coburn.
You want to press your, yeah.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and distinguished members of the committee for taking time today to explore the injustices, that have taken place within the NFL and the Washington football team. I'm grateful that you recognize the severity of this issue and why it's important to men and women in the workplace. The Washington football team engaged in harassment and abuse openly and without consequence for more than 2 decades. I personally experienced harassment and misogyny during my 14 years with the organization, both as a cheerleader and marketing executive. I eventually left in 2011 because my work environment routinely made me feel anxious and unsafe. The harassment and objectification of the cheerleaders was constant. Under Dan Snyder's leadership, women were used as sex objects and tools to increase sales rather than dignified human beings. At cheerleader auditions one year, Dan Snyder ordered the director of the squad to parade the ladies onto the field while he and his friends gawked from his suite through binoculars. The women were directed to turn around slowly, as if they were cattle being examined for sale. One of the women cried on the sidelines because she didn't understand what was happening. The next year, we had to start an ambassador squad made up of beautiful women who were not cheerleaders, but dressed to look like them. They were paraded through suites, and in later years, the men who paid for those suites were invited to come to our calendar shoots and to judge our auditions. Over the years, it became clear that Dan Snyder and his male executives were far too interested in the cheerleaders. Eventually, Dan himself had the final say of who made the team and who got months in the calendar. Unbelievably, he requested binders of photographs for auditions and the calendar so that he could choose who to cut based on looks, not talent. One year, he cut 10 veterans who otherwise would have made the team based on their skill and experience, evidently because they weren't the prettiest in his opinion. It was known as the Tyson's Massacre. Think about that. An NFL owner who hired and fired employees based solely on their looks. It's despicable. During calendar production one year, a male executive took unedited prints off the graphic designer's desk despite my warnings to protect them. One of these compromising full-size photos was one of the team's most loyal employees and my dear friend. She's sitting next to me today. I'm still haunted by this. And at the time, there was no HR department or any reporting mechanism for this abusive behavior. While cheerleaders are rightfully proud of their skill as dancers, their athleticism, and their beauty, executives essentially treated them as a collection of toys. I recall one time the team arranged for the cheerleaders to wash cars in their uniform at an event for a new sponsor. The ads for this event were completely inappropriate and displayed what appeared to be exotic dancers washing cars, not cheerleaders. Bottom line, women were objects. We were disposable and exploited over and over. I felt compelled to come forward publicly when I read the second shocking Post article that revealed 2 lewd videos of the cheerleaders that were secretly created. I was physically ill when I read that piece. The Good Bits videos, produced at the behest of Dan Snyder, were secretly made from footage taken at our calendar shoots. We trusted the production team to capture footage and keep it safe. Little did we know they were zooming in on private parts and keeping cameras rolling during costume changes. I've cried with the women in these videos as they explain the horror of seeing themselves in what is essentially a soft porn video, soundtrack to Dan Snyder's favorite bands. These women remain traumatized. I stayed at the team years longer than I wanted to because I felt compelled to do what I could do to protect the cheerleaders. But it was not just cheerleaders who were exploited and harassed. It was the overwhelming majority of female employees working for the team. The culture and environment in those offices was deplorable, like a frat party run by a billionaire who knew no boundaries. Early in my marketing role, I was invited to an awards trip in Aspen. I was one of 2 women that stayed in Dan Snyder's home. After a drunken dinner at a restaurant that included watching my boss go shot for shot with a female employee and seeing another colleague hazed to drink despite being a recovering addict, I returned to Dan Snyder's house only to be sent to my room in the basement and told to stay there. I later learned from a colleague who was there that it was because the men had invited prostitutes back. I've had many sleepless nights and anxiety-ridden days the past 18 months. Reliving these events has been traumatic, but beyond this pain, there's fear. Dan Snyder rules by fear. We've seen Dan's vindictive wrath for years, such as when he nearly bankrupted the Washington City paper for an unflattering article. He sent private investigators to the homes of a dozen former cheerleaders last year, and I got calls from these terrified women who didn't understand why PIs were showing up on their doorsteps. He offered hush money to a group of us in exchange for our silence last February, but we declined. This was offensive and certainly felt like intimidation and witness tampering to us. The NFL is now complicit in this scandal. Its commissioner, Roger Goodell, asked the investigator to give an oral report, so we can't corroborate the victim's claims, and there's nothing official for the public to react to. 10 months, more than 120 witnesses, and nothing. Roger Goodell's claim that he was trying to protect us is outrageous and cowardly. The public optics of him caring is appalling. Goodell betrayed every woman who suffered harassment and abuse at the Washington football team. Finally, I am a daughter, a sister, a wife. I am called mommy by two amazing boys who now know what sexual harassment is. I came forward at great personal risk to try to effect change for the future. There must be transparency so there can be true accountability. I'm here today in hopes that you will demand the NFL release the report. Thank you, and I'm willing to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Johnston, you are now recognized for your statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and members of the committee for holding this important roundtable. My name is Tiffany Johnston. I appreciate you all for taking the time to hear about the constant workplace sexual harassment that occurred at the Washington football team for over 2 decades. I personally experienced it multiple times during my 8-year tenure as both a cheerleader and a marketing manager. It is never easy for me to tell my story publicly. I basically block these experiences to avoid dealing with the trauma. I am ready to talk, I am ready to tell the full story, and I am beyond ready to see accountability. Dan Snyder and the Washington football team need to be held accountable, and the report needs to be released. I am here today to tell you about the sexual advances by Dan Snyder and the constant unprofessionalism and boys' locker room culture that started at the top with Dan Snyder and continued down the line with all of Dan Snyder's senior team. I began working for the Washington football team in 2002 after a team executive approached me and presented me with an opportunity. He said he was creating a new position with the club-level tickets team, a marketing and events coordinator, and he had me in mind from our interactions at team events while I was a cheerleader. He and I went to breakfast to discuss the opportunity, and after lots of conversations with my parents, I was in my early 20s after all, and with my boss at Booz Allen Hamilton, I decided if there ever was a time to leave a distinguished, incredibly professional company like Booz Allen to take a job with an NFL team now in my early 20s was the time. Boy, did I learn a lot at the Washington football team under top executives and Dan Snyder. Let me share some of the highlights I learned during my tenure with the team. I learned what a pearl necklace is while in a marketing meeting with my boss and male coworkers. And it's not the kind you receive from your grandmother at 8th grade graduation. For those of you who didn't know, like my mom, it's an offensive sexual term. I learned from another high-level executive that I should wear low-cut blouses when making sales pitches to potential suite owners. Apparently, it generates faster sales. I also learned from this same executive that the best way to avoid an uncomfortable situation in front of potential suite owners is to just do what my boss asks, which on one occasion involved him tossing me in the air to do a cheerleader stunt for a client while I was wearing a skirt. I learned on one specific occasion that when I was asked by my boss to attend a networking event, and to dress cute, it was actually an orchestration by him and Dan Snyder to put me in a compromising sexual situation. I learned that placing me strategically by the owner at a work dinner after this networking event was not for me to discuss business, but to allow him, Dan Snyder, to place his hand on my thigh under the table. I learned how to discreetly remove a man's unwanted hand from my thigh at a crowded dinner table at a busy restaurant to avoid a scene. I learned that job survival meant I should continue my conversation with another coworker rather than call out Dan Snyder right then in the moment. I also learned later that evening how to awkwardly laugh when Dan Snyder aggressively pushed me towards his limo with his hand on my lower back, encouraging me to ride with him to my car. I learned how to continue to say no, even though a situation was getting more awkward, uncomfortable, and physical. I learned that the only reason Dan Snyder removed his hand from my back and stopped pushing me towards his limo was because his attorney intervened and said, Dan, this is a bad idea. A very bad idea, Dan. I learned that I should remove myself from Dan's grip while his attorney was distracting him. I also learned at that moment during an unspoken conversation between my boss and I that my boss was not there to look out for me. He was there to listen to any directive his boss, Dan Snyder, had given to him at my cost. The next day I learned when I told a senior coworker about Dan Snyder's sexual advance that I should, quote, not repeat this story to anyone outside this office door. That was when I also learned there was no one to go to about Dan Snyder's advance, no path to report the incident, so I learned to move on. As a Washington Redskins cheerleader, I learned a lot as well. In the last couple of years, I learned that Dan Snyder, via senior vice president, demanded my unedited, enlarged lingerie calendar photo be sent to his office. I learned that this demand was made urgently because they knew that the graphic artist was getting ready to Photoshop my personal areas before the edited proof went before all of the senior VPs and Dan Snyder for approval. This is my story. I also learned by recounting these details and telling the story that I at some point subconsciously developed an emotional wall that I can only assume is a means to protect myself as a result of my tenure at the Washington football team. This has affected me more than I originally thought. This is something no woman should be subjected to in the workplace. No one should have to learn about pearl necklaces or be objectified and harassed, and certainly no one should have to fend off sexual advances from a company's owner. I sit here before you and hope that my words will have a lasting impact as these events have had on me, so we can work to hold all employers accountable for ensuring a safe and professional workplace. Transparency should be the standard so that accountability follows. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, you are now recognized for your statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and members of the committee for holding this important roundtable. My name is Brad Baker, and I worked for the Washington football team from 2007 to 2009 in the video production department. I grew up a diehard Redskins fan, diehard. On my first day at what I thought was going to be my dream job, I quickly learned that the Washington football team was a place where male executives regularly harassed, demeaned, and bullied women in the workplace, and they got away with it. For decades, they got away with it. I'm testifying today because the Washington football team must be held accountable for the toxic workplace it created and the harm it caused so many people. We were told on day one to never make eye contact with Dan Snyder, never speak to him. If you must speak about him, he's referred to as Mr. Snyder or the owner. If he's walking towards you, duck into the nearest office. Under no circumstances should you interact with him. Things only got worse from there. In the early summer of 2008, a normal production meeting with the video department was wrapping up when Larry Michael, then executive producer of media and one of Snyder's top lieutenants, asked me and two other male producers to stay behind and shut the door. The female members of the department were dismissed. Larry Michael told us that the owner had a special project for us and needed us to edit together a video of the good bits from our cheerleader calendar video shoot. It wasn't hard to put two and two together. Larry Michael, one of Snyder's top confidants, has tasked us with producing a video for Snyder of sexually suggestive footage of cheerleaders, obviously unbeknownst to any of the women involved. One of the senior producers said he'd take care of it, and later on, while passing through the editing suite, I saw several images on both the editing monitor and the monitor of our tape deck that featured the cheerleaders posing for their photo shoot, but it was like outtakes, and their breasts and pubic areas were exposed. It became crystal clear that my worst suspicions were true. The video department had been told to edit together lewd footage of the cheerleaders at the request of Dan Snyder. So why did I speak up and share this story with the Washington Post? I was inspired by Emily Applegate, my former colleague Megan Imbert, and the stories of so many other women who are now speaking up. I was still working in sports at the time, and it's a notoriously hostile, abusive, and sexually harassing industry in which to work. I felt like if we all spoke up, told the truth, and believed in the process, that we could make a positive impact and inspire some change in workplace culture all over the country, especially in the world of sports. But now here we are, because the National Football League swept the findings of the Wilkinson investigation under the rug. The NFL has refused to release the report of the Wilkinson investigation, even though myself and over 100 other employees were asked by the league to speak to the Wilkinson firm. We all participated because we thought the NFL wanted to know the truth. We believed that the toxic workplace culture and the serious harm it caused would finally become public and that the investigation would end with some kind of report. I mean, they were able to release a report that was 243 pages long, 243 pages long on the PSIs of footballs, the pounds per square inch of footballs. Surely, women being sexually harassed and lewd outtakes videos of female employees created without their consent could muster up some kind of written report, right? Even as employees came forward, Dan Snyder still tried to control them and intimidate them by hiring private investigators to contact the various employees during the Wilkinson investigation. Snyder had private investigators digging around in my past. Do you know what it feels like to have someone dig into your personal life? To worry that a friend or family member is going to be called by a PI? Even with threats of intimidation, I and many other former employees came forward to speak with the NFL investigators because we believed that the NFL would finally take action against Snyder and the Washington football team. And you know what? Turns out the NFL does not care. If they cared, they'd have held up their end of the bargain by meeting the smallest and most basic expectation any of us ever had of them: to be transparent and release a report. All we're asking for is transparency. That's all we've ever wanted. Once the horrors of working at the Washington football team are exposed, accountability will undoubtedly follow. But we can't determine accountability without transparency. And that's why I'm begging you, the United States Congress, and our elected officials to compel the National Football League to do the absolute bare minimum and release the report.
Thank you. Ms. Nunez, you're now recognized for your statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and members of the committee for holding this important roundtable. My name is Nunez, and I worked in sales for the Washington football team for almost 4 years. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for my colleagues, both women and men, who are here before you, survivors of the abuse and sexual harassment that we endured during our time working for the Washington football team. I am also here as a representative of the dozens more that cannot be here. The NFL did not protect us when they needed to, but they still have a chance to make it right. The NFL preaches about inspiring change, but that only seems to be the case when it's convenient for them. I hope today makes a difference, and I hope with Congress's involvement, we can achieve some accountability for the team and the NFL. I was employed at the Washington football team from March of 2015 to January of 2019. I was 23 when I began working there in the sales department. During my time with the team, I was sexually harassed by multiple male employees, including top executives. Often these male employees had a reputation for mistreating young female employees. Everyone knew about their mistreatment and even saw it happening, but no one did anything. When I became a victim and tried to report it, no one did anything about it. I won't describe every instance of sexual harassment I experienced during my time there because it was almost a part of my everyday experience. But I want to share some examples with you that really stuck with me. In 2017, while I was working at what was formerly known as Redskins Park, I endured sexual harassment by 2 senior-level employees. The first was the senior vice president of communications who came to my desk and commented on my jeans I was wearing in a very inappropriate way. This executive had a reputation for making inappropriate comments about female colleagues' attire and their bodies, just as he did with me, but he was so high up in the organization that we were afraid to say anything. He did this in front of everyone, and no one seemed to care. Around the same time, I was also sexually harassed by the director of pro personnel. I connected with this individual because he was of Latino background, and there were only a handful of non-white employees there. What started as friendly and professional conversations quickly turned into him texting inappropriate messages that made me feel extremely uncomfortable. In one exchange, he told me I looked nice and mentioned the things he would do to me. I responded back via text and told him to never say things like that to me again. I was afraid to push back like that because he was more senior than me, and it shouldn't have been my responsibility. But I knew there was no real HR, and no one would have done anything to make him stop, so I had to stand up for myself. This man had a well-known history of sexual harassment with other employees and interns, so I also felt ashamed that I became another victim of his. These were the times that I felt hopeful there would be a change, only to be disappointed. In early summer 2018, with the arrival of new leadership, it felt like a horrible workplace culture could finally be addressed. I was encouraged to speak to the assistant legal counsel for the team about my experience with sexual harassment, which I did. I sat in his office, told him the stories, saw him write in his notebook, and I accepted the tissues he offered me when I became emotionally overwhelmed that someone might finally do something to change the workplace culture. But I was wrong. Nothing came from me telling him what I had gone through. Even worse, the sexual harassment continued. Later that summer at training camp in Richmond, I was with colleagues, including the head trainer. After an after-work gathering, when we got up to leave, he had grabbed my wrist and asked, "What are we going to talk about us?" I think I asked, "What about us?" There is no us. I had never had a conversation with this man before. I felt ashamed and embarrassed because once again, I felt the fear of retaliation and the shame of being sexually harassed. Again, I felt like there was no point in reporting him because no one had been held accountable before. I stand before you here today, reliving these difficult memories to try to make a change for other women at the team, in the league, the industry, and the workplace. There are just some of the stories that the Washington football team and the NFL have tried so hard to hide. I want to shine a light on the toxic workplace that we endured and to plead with the NFL to release the report from the Wilkinson investigation, holding the Washington football accountable here and sending the message that this is the type of harassment and abuse that will not be tolerated, will impact the many women and men who endure similar harassment, not only in sports, but also in workplaces across the country.
Ms. Eagleson, thank you, Ms. Eagleson. You are now recognized for your statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and the committee for holding this important roundtable on an issue that directly impacts myself, those present, and women across the country who hold 50% of American jobs. I wish that I didn't have to be here sharing personal and intimate details about my life, details that are public knowledge and can be easily searched on the internet. I wish that I didn't have to resort to speaking to the Washington Post for there to be any sort of public investigation into the team. I wish that when I reported my experiences to the team and to the NFL that there would have been change and accountability. But at this point, my options have been exhausted, and that's led me here to reveal truths and details once again about myself and my experience working at the Washington football team. 81% of women have reported experiencing some sort of sexual harassment and/or assault in their lifetime. I wish that I didn't become a part of that statistic at my place of employment. I worked at the Washington football team for 8 years, and I can't recall a time that I didn't experience or fear sexual harassment. It was just a pervasive part of the culture and an unavoidable rite of passage being a woman who worked there. Working for the team was my first full-time job out of college, and I was so excited to start working for the team. I grew up in Maryland, and I rooted and cheered for them my entire life. I experienced many work firsts there. First bonus, first promotion, first office potluck, first employee hire, first threat of physical violence by a supervisor, first hostile work environment, first public humiliation, first sexual assault. When I initially reported sexual harassment to my boss, I was terrified. I was only 24, and the man who sexually harassed me was old enough to be my father, and he also was considered the voice of the team in the public sphere. So to me, the power that he held in his position and his close personal relationship with Daniel Snyder was enough for me to reconsider anything. And at the time, I didn't know and realize that 55% of victims experience retaliation after speaking up or making a claim. I still decided to tell my boss about my harasser's public comments about my appearance, his unwanted kisses on the cheek, and the emails about special gifts he expected from me. When I told my boss, we agreed that nothing would happen if I reported it to the person who was supposedly running HR at that point. And so my boss called my harasser on the phone. Mind you, we were in 2 different locations. I was in Maryland and he was in Virginia, so this had to be done via phone call. I was in the room when my boss called him to tell him to leave me alone, and it's a memory I'll never forget because I distinctly remember hearing my harasser yell through the phone, "What the fuck is she thinking?" And I just kind of muted everything after that. So fearing further harassment and retaliation, I took to hiding from him at public events. I strategically would place myself between colleagues so he couldn't get near me. And I just felt humiliated to have to hide in plain sight in front of all of my colleagues, my clients, and I was just so frustrated that I had to avoid company functions for fear that I would experience sexual harassment again. And most of all, it made me feel worthless. All the hard work I put into my work and the team, and I was reduced to my appearance and not my value as an employee. The second time I decided to report harassment was with the arrival of a new executive team, similar to Anna, that was specifically hired to help change the business. I told them about the public comments about my appearance, the unwanted kisses on the cheek, the email, as well as the time at training camp I was sexually assaulted by the same man that I had previously reported. Those executives were appalled at my treatment and had good intentions to effect change, but they were all fired within 6 months of reporting this. And after they were fired, and this was reportedly because the old guard at the Washington football team did not want change, I just felt like I had zero protection. I didn't want to go back to avoiding people, clients, events, and even my own job to keep away from my harasser. So I resigned from my position without another job lined up so I wouldn't have to deal with this. It's my sincere hope that Congress will hold the Washington football team and the NFL accountable for creating and maintaining a toxic workplace for so long, and that burying the results of the 10-month investigation would reveal exactly what happened and who was responsible. The 20-year reign of sole team owner now, Dan Snyder, an era permeated with bullying, verbal abuse, sexual harassment, and sexual assault, has unfortunately been given the stamp of approval by the NFL. Myself and many other brave individuals have come forward to share our experiences and actively participate in the investigation we believed would be fair and transparent. It wasn't. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell used us and the investigation to make it seem like he cared about this issue, but then he blamed us for not receiving or releasing a report. Let's be very clear, the people that I know that participated in this investigation wanted and expected a report. There must be transparency, and only then can we have real accountability. This is not just about the Washington football team and its employees. It's about the millions of women in workplaces across the country who endure harassment every day in our everyday lives. It's about the message that the NFL sent to American women everywhere when it brushed aside the victims who came forward and embraced Dan Snyder. That message was, we don't care about you and you don't matter. We are now here before all of you in Congress, once again telling our stories and revealing intimate details about ourselves that we shouldn't have to. I look forward to seeing what you all and what Congress message, the message that you all send to workplaces and women across America. Thank you.
Ms. Applegate, you're now recognized for your statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Maloney and the rest of the members of the committee for being here today and for taking the steps necessary to create a change that all women can benefit from, the opportunity to work in environments free of harassment. My name is Emily Applegate. I began working for the Washington football team exactly 8 years ago as of tomorrow. While my time with the team was short, my experiences there have altered the structure of my entire life. In July of 2020, the Washington Post published a story that quoted me saying, working for the Washington football team was the most miserable experience of my life. I stand by that statement to this day. To add to it, dealing with the NFL, Roger Goodell, and Dan Snyder has continued to be the most miserable experience. On a daily basis, I was sexually harassed by my direct boss, the chief marketing officer of the team. Every day, I was forced into uncomfortable conversations about my body and about my appearance. I was told to wear tight outfits to events so clients had something to look at. I was asked invasive questions about my dating life, specifically if I was interested in older men because my boss was significantly older than me. I was told I wasn't allowed to wear flat shoes because he liked the way my body looked better when I was in high heels. My photograph was taken without my permission and passed to other executives throughout the team by my boss. I was called Jewish slurs that referred to a non-Jewish woman that you are sexualizing. A slur, which I will not repeat, a rabbi described as simply indefensible, condescending, racist, and misogynistic. When I stood up for myself, I was told that I was a distraction, as if it was my fault that grown men in a professional setting could not control themselves. To address the most common question that I get, why didn't you report to Human Resources? I didn't report to Human Resources because Dan Snyder created a culture where this behavior was accepted and encouraged. I was told not to speak to Dan Snyder. I was told to never even look Dan Snyder in the eye. Many employees were intimidated into not speaking to our boss and intimidated into not reporting the harassment they experienced or they witnessed. Any time suggestions were made to create processes to report the behavior that we're describing today, it seemed to fall on deaf ears, as evidenced by the fact that little to no concrete changes were ever made. If changes were made, the culture of harassment would have never been able to continue. Instead of taking any accountability, Dan Snyder and his wife have claimed to be victims. While at the same time the harassment investigation was happening, they accumulated more wealth from becoming the sole owners of the Washington football team, courtesy of the NFL. Roger Goodell has proven once again he is unequipped to handle important issues within the NFL. He has mishandled social justice issues, domestic violence issues, and now sexual harassment issues. Worst of all, there have been so many good people that have become collateral damage while these two men cover up 2 decades of sexual harassment. Today is when the journey of truly holding these people accountable begins. Today is when Democrats and Republicans can come together and ensure that what we experienced will not happen anywhere else throughout this country. Today is when we can make a difference and we can show the American people how impactful Congress can be. Those that sit here today and many others came forward at great personal risk. We did our part believing that what we were doing would help employees across the country, but to our shock and our disappointment, the NFL did nothing. When the investigation of the air pressure of Tom Brady's football concludes with 200+ pages of a written report, but 2 decades of sexual harassment concludes with nothing, the NFL is showing us their complete lack of respect for women, for their employees, and for the culture of our country. The same as every day, I'm asking for transparency and accountability. I am once again asking the NFL to release the report and to take appropriate action. I'm so grateful to every woman and man who spoke out about their experiences with the Washington football team. It is extremely difficult to repeatedly share your personal experiences, especially on such a large stage. Thank you all again for taking this issue on. This issue is big enough that if handled properly, will positively affect the people's lives across the country. I'm looking forward to seeing our government work to improve the lives of all Americans by putting an end to sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of the panelists for your courage today. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes. On July 1st, 2021, the NFL issued a press release announcing the outcome of its investigation into the Washington football team, stating, and I quote, "None of the managers or executives identified as having engaged in misconduct is still employed at the club," end quote. Ms. Johnson, your opening statement included startling new allegations against team owner Daniel Snyder. So let me ask you directly, is the NFL statement that wrongdoers have been removed from the Washington football team accurate?
Absolutely not. It all started from the top with Dan Snyder, every day on every single issue.
So it hasn't been removed, and how do you know that to be the case?
I witnessed it. I witnessed it in marketing meetings. Any marketing flyer that went out had to be approved by Dan Snyder. We'd be on the phone with him telling us changes, the smallest changes, from the verbiage we used to the player's picture we used. And then it was the culture he created. It was an abusive one. He berated the male employees when they didn't do what he considered a good job. And then it was just the sexual culture he created every day, day in and day out.
Ms. Johnson, I received a letter dated today from Jason Friedman, a former vice president who worked for the Washington football team for over 20 years. And here is the letter. He was apparently with you the night that Dan Snyder personally harassed you. And here's what he said. He has never told his story publicly before, and I want to quote now from his letter. He says, I witnessed Dan Snyder grab the arm of my coworker, Tiffany Johnston, and attempt to pull her into his limousine. This took place over a dinner in Washington, D.C. I was shocked. Thankfully, Tiffany was able to quickly pull away. Ms. Johnson, I want to thank you for coming forward, for your courage and the courage of the others at this table that has inspired others to come forward. My hope is that they will remain inspired until the full truth comes out, but we have a steep climb. That is because for nearly 2 decades, Mr. Snyder has used non-disclosure agreements to silence employees who have experienced sexual harassment and other workplace abuses. He has made it difficult for employees to come forward due to fear of retaliation. I'd like to ask Ms. Nunez. Ms. Nunez, do you believe that employers should be able to use NDAs to prevent employees from disclosing sexual harassment, discrimination, and other workplace misconduct?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Congress must act to protect workers from the abusive scope of non-disclosure agreements, not being able to report, and other abuses. I look forward to working on legislative reforms with my colleagues to address this troubling practice. I now recognize Mrs. Fox, Representative Fox.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, today this committee is holding a roundtable to examine the Washington football team's toxic workplace culture. I'm truly saddened to hear these stories, and I agree with the participants who noted in their heart-wrenching statements that this type of behavior has no place in any workplace and is disgusting. The proper venue to explore these types of claims is in the courtroom, not before this committee. To my knowledge, there's no pending litigation regarding the events we've heard discussed today, nor does this committee have legislative jurisdiction over this issue. It concerns me that this committee is choosing to spend its limited time having this discussion on the NFL and second-guessing decisions when there are multiple Biden-caused catastrophes that desperately need our attention and oversight. And the witnesses here have begged for us to do something, and nothing is going to happen as a result of this committee. That's cruel to these people. I'm not sure why this committee does not devote the same level of effort and attention to the crisis on our southern border, to the heightened tensions with Russia and China, to skyrocketing inflation, or to the Biden administration's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Congress and this committee are charged with providing oversight and ensuring the efficacy, effectiveness, and accountability of the federal government and its agencies. To do this, the committee has bills it should immediately consider related to aiding our recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and preparing for future pandemics, as well as measures to provide state and local governments relief from crushing federal mandates and bills to streamline and simplify the federal bureaucracy. We need to refocus on our stated mission. Madam Chair, but I'd like to ask the witnesses a question. Thankfully, numerous resources exist to combat sexual harassment in the workplace, yet you all have informed us that these resources were not accessible to you at the time. What barriers did you experience in the organization which prevented you from getting help? You've described problems. Do you believe these barriers still exist today, and why? Ms. Nunez, I'll ask you that question.
So definitely retaliation. Everyone, it was a small building, everyone knew what was going on, so the moment you would tell someone, someone would tell someone and it would get to the top. So there was no secret that if I went to HR and said what I said, that would get to somebody else who then would be in a position of power to retaliate against me, which eventually did happen.
So let me ask you this, all of you. What advice do you have for others who are in a situation like you have described today? Would you do things differently? Ms. Coburn, Ms. Johnston, Ms. Nunez. Yes.
Yes, I would do things differently, except we didn't have a protocol. There was no procedure. There was no handbook. And the HR person who was the HR representative that I went to when I was personally harassed by a football player back in 2005, I sent an email to him. He didn't reply to my email, but he gave me a phone call and said that, well, I'm sorry that this is happening, and if it's going to be him or you, it's going to be you. And he basically told me there was nothing I could do.
But did you not know there's an EEOC? Did you not know that there are federal laws that bar sexual harassment?
I mean, no. I mean, I was young. It was my first job, and I did not know that there was other places for me to go. But I would have lost my job, and that would have been that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize Chairman Krishnamurthy, who will be taking over this hearing as I have a conflict with this roundtable discussion, as I have a conflict with the President of the United States, who is in important meetings in New York on gun safety, schools, and other items. So, Raja, Chairman Krishnamurthy, you're now please take over the hearing now.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Maloney. Ms. Johnston, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to all of you for sharing your stories. Ms. Johnston, I want to turn your attention to the work dinner with Mr. Snyder you referenced in your opening. Under D.C. law, it's a crime to touch someone sexually without their consent. There are 3 components to this crime. First, that the defendant committed a sexual touching. Second, that he did so voluntarily, on purpose, without accident, and not by accident. And third, that the victim did not consent to being touched in that manner. I want to just ask you about these 3 components of this crime. First, Mr. Snyder touched you in a sexual manner that night, correct?
Correct.
Snyder did so on purpose, right?
Correct.
How do you know that?
He left his hand on the middle of my thigh until I physically removed it.
You did not consent to being touched in that way, right?
Absolutely not.
I want to turn your attention to reporting this incident after it happened. You said that the next day, you reported his sexual advances to a more senior coworker. Apparently, you went to his office, and all he said was that you, quote, should not repeat this story to anyone outside this office door, correct?
Correct.
Snyder never faced any consequences for harassing you, right?
No.
Nobody faced any consequences, is that right?
Correct.
In response to media reports, including in the Washington Post in the summer of 2020, that the WFT was rife with sexual harassment, Snyder issued a statement saying he was, quote, unaware of these allegations until they surfaced in the media. Based on what you know, Ms. Johnston, is that statement true or false?
Completely false.
And why do you say that?
He was involved in everything, every minor detail, every major detail of every single day at the office.
And he was, of course, involved in the sexual harassment of you.
Absolutely.
Ma'am, Snyder claimed he had, quote, admittedly been too hands-off as an owner, close quote. Unfortunately, as with Ms. Johnston, the opposite was true. Mr. Snyder was all too hands-on, not hands-off. I now recognize the gentleman from...
Would my friend yield, since he has a little bit more time, just real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
No one in the metropolitan area would believe anything other than the fact that Mr. Snyder is a control freak. And Ms. Johnston is absolutely right. He's involved in every aspect of this team and its operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy. I want to thank each one of you for coming. It takes courage to do what you're doing. The sad part, I think you could multiply for each one of you by multiples of 5, 10, 20 people that have experienced the same thing. I had heard about Dan Snyder for a long time. I quit going, I took my actions against our team when in the Carolina Panthers, I'm from South Carolina, when they stopped standing for the flag, when the owner had all these charges. You know what I did? I just didn't go. I stopped. So that's the actions I took. Ms. Johnson, the letter that Ms. Maloney read you, we have sent her many letters to have hearings, just like we're having here. But we would come to a meeting every week, multiple times, if they would have hearings on the border crisis. I wish I could take y'all to the rape trees, where the husband had to watch the wife getting raped because he wouldn't pay a drug dealer. Crickets, we hear from this group. I wish we could, take y'all, have hearings on the cities that are burning, the families that have lost loved ones, the police that are being killed every day. The president's there after the fact. He didn't have the courage to go to the funeral. I wish we could, could have hearings on why the $80 billion in aid was left to Afghanistan, which countries that don't particularly like us. I wish we could have hearings on the January 6th, the people that died there, and have people who were directly responsible for the security here, namely the Sergeant of Arms, and namely Nancy Pelosi. Let's get her up here and have a hearing. But no, we don't do that. And like Ms. Fox says, you know what's going to come of this hearing? Nothing. I wish I could say something differently, but we're having it. You're all victims of it, and it's not right. But I guess let me ask each one of you in 53 seconds quickly. Once we get the report, what do you want us to do? What should Congress do? I can't legislate bad behavior to stop it. Just quickly, what would you do? Let's start with Ms. Coburn.
I think once the report is released, accountability will come naturally. Daniel Snyder should not be managing any human beings. He should not be in a power position amongst any employees. He needs to be held accountable for his actions.
Agree 100%. Real quickly, Ms. Johnson.
Once the report is released, there will be accountability because of the includings in there are so despicable. And for him to receive a $10 million fine, that's pocket change to him, and even worse, to put his wife in charge, having the report become transparent and released it won't give people a choice, but there has to be some repercussions.
But accountability from Congress to do what? That's what I'm asking.
To get involved, to not allow this to happen, starting with the Washington football team, throughout the entire country, at the workplace, for every female that has experienced this that we can hopefully prevent for tomorrow.
Can they, Chairman Christopher, can they answer the question? Mr.
They
Baker.
can finish the question.
I don't think anybody's discrediting or discounting any of the other issues you're bringing up. I just don't understand why this isn't an important issue.
You're here. It is an important issue. I'm saying.
Right, but I feel like you're trying to be a little bit dismissive of what happened in comparison to other things, and I think this is just as important as those things.
Who said it wasn't? Ms. Applegate made a correct comment. Bipartisan, getting together. We don't hear anything on any of these other things. I would come, anyway, Ms. Nunez, go ahead.
That's not, Mr. Chairman, that's not what Mr. Norman said at all, and I don't think Mr. Baker has a lot of moral authority to talk about a whole lot in this hearing based on some of the emails that have been published in the last few minutes. But go ahead,
Mr.
Ralph.
Comer,
Ms. Nunez.
I think the gentleman's time has expired.
Can they finish, point of order, can they finish answering the question?
I can answer the
Okay,
question.
why don't you finish, Ms. Applegate, and then we'll move on.
Thank you for asking this question, actually, because I think it's very important due to the fact that multiple members of the committee has now said that this is not the appropriate venue for us to be sharing this story and that we should be in the courtroom, things like that. You guys have the opportunity to take this issue on, pass legislation that would help other employees throughout the United States be able to report so they have that opportunity to be in the courtroom. And not only the opportunity to be in the courtroom, but then also to find some justice. Because I think we can all agree that a lot of people go through the criminal justice system and they never see any type of justice when it comes to sexual harassment or sexual assault. So until those two things are taken more seriously by Congress, then nothing is going to happen. But that's why we're here today, to ask you to do your job and pass those legislation laws.
So thank you, Ms. Applegate. And to my dear colleagues on the other side, I just want to point out that we legislate the rules, regulations, and laws that govern workplace safety, as well as non-disclosure agreement laws and so forth. On top of that, we've had 2 briefings regarding Afghanistan. Of course, we have the January 6th committee, and we've had oversight with regard to January 6th. And finally, we've had multiple hearings with regard to defense contractor, waste, fraud, and abuse, federal cybersecurity, FEMA, FBI, and so forth. We can walk and chew gum in this committee. We can do all of the above.
Would the chairman yield?
Let me go to Congresswoman Norton, and then maybe I'll come to you after that. Congresswoman Norton, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, in response to what appears to be an orchestrated response from the other side that this matter is not as important compared with other issues that this committee could be looking at, I want to indicate that sexual harassment has become such a widespread national issue that I have introduced a bill for a national commission on sexual harassment. In 1918, when the Washington football team mistreatment of its cheerleaders first became front-page news, Mr. Snyder brought in a new team of executives led by Brian LaFema. Ms. Engelson did the arrival of Mr. Femina and his team give you any hope that things might change at the Washington Football League?
Yes, they started and implemented new policies. They were committed to hiring a practiced HR professional to be at the team, and they brought in third-party resources to teach all employees about sexual harassment and assault, with the notion that that was their first time there and they would be coming back. So yes, I had every confidence that they would be changing the culture.
Well, then what happened to Mr. LaFemina and his team? Were they successful in implementing these changes?
No, because they were all fired before many of these instances could come to fruition. So no, they were not successful because they were just at the precipice of instituting change.
Did things get better for you after Mr. LaFemina was forced to leave the team?
No, the only person who was protecting me was the team's lawyer, and he was the only person who had my back. I still had to have meetings with the same person who sexually harassed and assaulted me. There was no follow-up from HR whatsoever, so no, I didn't have anyone at the team, and that's why I left.
When Commissioner Goodell announced the conclusion of Ms. Wilkinson's investigation, Mr. Snyder said he was, and here I'm quoting him, making a new commitment to ensuring that every employee of the Washington football team comes to a professional and respectful workplace every day. Ms. Eagleson, based on your experience with the Washington football team, do you believe this commitment is sincere?
No, because he made the same commitment in 2018, and there were policies that were recommended by the investigation into the Carolina Panthers that clearly didn't go into effect and trickle down to the Washington football team. So no, I don't think he's being sincere.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Harrell, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask for unanimous consent of this committee to enter this article into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, nobody is more disgusted by the claims of sexual harassment than I am. But after reviewing all the information, I'm struck about how these witnesses left the team happy about their time there, yet 10 years later, you have them on a panel to say how poisonous the atmosphere was. I'm even more troubled that some of the women who talk about the terrible experience they endured offered to help bring new women into the organization as cheerleaders after they themselves had left. In fact, one of the witnesses on the panel even said, back then, "I will always be a Redskin. I am leaving with a smile on my face as I have many wonderful experiences and relationships to take with me." I don't discount that it was an awful environment at the time, There is zero excuse for the way some of these people behaved, but it seems strange to me that after the team's management fired the bad actors, paid millions in fines and settlement, has changed the culture, and now here we are investigating something, the acts that happened 10 years ago. Mr. Chair, this hearing is a farce, and we should be looking at inflation, the economy, Afghanistan, the border crisis, and so many other issues that are important to our nation and to our constituents. Instead, we are spending time looking at a single business, investigating it for things that happened a decade ago. And let me restate again, the owners of the team fired those responsible. In fact, the owners paid the largest fine ever imposed by the NFL and was suspended indefinitely from operations. This roundtable is ridiculous, and it is abuse of power. This committee is turning into a Joe McCarthy commission, and we should not do that. I want to ask a question. Mr. Baker, are you here in support of these cheerleaders today?
I am.
Well, in light of your Twitter account, I would say that is questionable. I want to point out a Twitter that you posted December 2010 regarding Hannah Storm, and it says Hannah Storm had 3 mentions of unis in the top 10 this morning. She shouldn't talk clothes unless she's talking about dressing like a whore. Do you have any comment? This is your Twitter account.
I don't recall tweeting that, but I will say that anything that I've said in the past has nothing to do with what I encountered at the Washington football team.
Right, but don't you find it ironic that you're sitting here as a witness today in support of these women, and yet this is your account? In fact, Mr. Baker, do you support or respect minority groups?
Of course I do.
Right. But your Twitter account said on May 5th, Mexican people don't celebrate 4th of July. Just saying, you're not Mexican, not your holiday, #alcoholics. So I would say, Mr. Baker, that it's somewhat troubling for us to take this hearing seriously with you on this panel. I would also say that we should be talking about things that matter to the American people, like these masks made in China that are given to all the House committee members. We don't have the authority to change these things, and while I am sympathetic to what's happening, I think that we need to go back to basics and work on behalf of the American people. I'm sorry for what happened to you, but this committee can't fix it. This was 10 years ago. We've seen this culture move in the right direction, and
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
There was nothing to yield. You were over.
You can have
Let me now recognize Mr. Connolly, but before I do that, I apologize for the personal comments. Clearly, others on this panel were not quite happy with the time that they were at the Washington football team. Mr. Connolly, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. No one on our side is implying hurtful comments. We are elected by the people. The people want us to do something about all the crises in America, and that's what this committee
Mr. Chairman,
is in charge of.
Mr. Chairman, the
Oversight
gentleman is
for
not
federal
the
tax
gentleman is
dollars.
not stating a proper point of order, and this is a roundtable discussion where that is not appropriate.
I understand. Okay, Mr. Connolly, you are recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. And I'm sorry you're being victimized all over again.
Again, point of order.
It is
Mr.
my
Chairman,
time.
That is complete bullcrap. The American people want Congress to do its
Mr.
job.
Comer,
Chairman.
This committee's job
Comer,
is oversight
Misconduct order.
federal tax dollars.
Mr. Comer, let Mr. Connolly proceed.
Imply
Mr.
something
Connolly's
that's not
time.
happening.
I didn't imply anything. I said you're being victimized all over
That
again,
is
and I meant it.
absolute
It is
bullcrap.
wrong.
Mr. Comer?
No, I
Mr.
want
Chairman,
that struck
this is
from the
my
record.
time,
I rise to point of
and
order.
all
Just
Mr.
do
Comer is
not
doing is
start
giving me more of it.
You are pandering.
If you want to give me more time, keep on going, Mr. Comer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Connolly, you're recognized
This is a
for 3
sordid
minutes.
tale about power, greed, and money. And you know, we saw the name change yesterday. But until this pervasive culture of abuse and impunity ends, it's nothing more than lipstick on a pig. Ms. Coburn, in your testimony, you described something very troubling, and I don't think it come out before, and that was an incident that occurred at Mr. Snyder's house, apparently, in Aspen, Colorado. This troubled you. Could you expand on what happened and why you saw this as part of a pattern of abuse?
It was a boys' club. It was a fraternity party. There was excessive drinking all the time. There was hazing. I watched my boss, who is not this type, was not that type of person, who I respected very much, doing shots that is not something that he would do. I watched a recovering addict, who, you know, was throwing up and missed the rest of the evening because he was so out of character. And yeah, there was, according to the male colleague I was with, there was prostitutes upstairs with the male executives at the home that I was staying in. Of course, there was only one other woman and I, both very young and single, that were invited to even stay in the home. So.
And would you say that was a unique experience, or did
a
that?
Very unique experience. I tell people often I'm very lucky that I was with the cheerleaders. We were at FedEx Field, away from Redskins Park. I avoided a lot of the personal sexual assault, harassment type situations. I had plenty of harassment from the male executives at various events, calendar shoots, and other things, but yeah.
You were with the team before Mr. Snyder came on board, is that correct?
Yes, I made the team in 97.
And how would you characterize the change that occurred with the arrival of Mr. Snyder before and after,
well, it went
from a cultural point of view?
Yeah, as a fan and as a cheerleader, it went from a family affair where everybody loved everybody. The ownership loved the cheerleader director. It was a very family-oriented place, to a business-forward sales mentality, sex sells, and that was it. It totally changed from, you know, a family winning football to how much money can we suck out of this franchise.
With a culture that demeaned women,
belittled, yes.
as a
Objectified
tool
women.
of raising money.
Yes.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The story that's being told today is very disturbing. I have no question that what these witnesses have said is factual, not only factually correct, but very despicable by the people who have perpetrated that. I would say to you that what we're doing here today, however, probably needs to be in a court of law. And that I am not a lawyer, do not understand what the law is necessarily related to this, but that I would say that no one would be above the law, even if you're in the NFL. And I don't know if anybody had ever approached law enforcement about sexual abuses or the district attorney that may be in the area. So I would ask any of you, was any of this ever reported to law enforcement?
Are you asking if we went to the police station to say that we were being sexually harassed by our bosses?
No, ma'am, I think I had heard sexual assaults also. I do understand the workplace misconduct. That is very inappropriate. And I do understand that evidently HR was not involved. I'm talking about there were things that were violations of the law where someone would have gone to a lawyer to seek legal help and or reporting that to the police.
I don't mind answering that since I was asked something similar about DC. I was
Thank you.
very young and very naive. And if I could do it all over again, I would have done something with the police. But at 24 years old and it being what you hope to be an exciting, prestigious job, it was not something that you considered when you didn't even have the first step of an HR department to go to. So to even consider taking it to the next level of the police, it just, unfortunately and regrettably, didn't occur to us.
Yes, ma'am. I think I'm also in reference to a lawyer, whether someone sought legal advice over a circumstance that several people felt like they were in. And I'm not trying to say you did or did not do the correct or right thing. I'm simply asking a question. Did anyone ever seek then a lawyer who might provide them some information about since you're 24 and young people, did anyone ever think about getting legal counsel?
I would love to answer that question. My desk was situated right outside of the Chief Marketing Officer's office, Mitch Gershman, right outside Bruce Allen's office, and right outside the Attorney General for the team at that time, Eric Schaefer's office. Eric Schaefer, obviously representing the Washington football team, that is his client, had a conversation with me about finding an attorney because what was going on in that building was against the law. To Tiffany's point, as a young 20-something-year-old, you really do not know what to do. When you are going to the Human Resources Department and you're getting nothing, do you really honestly believe that you're going to go to the police and get something about a workplace harassment issue? No, you do not. Do I think that, looking back on it, I wish that I went forward with an attorney? Yes, absolutely. But when you're being threatened with your job and you need to worry about paying rent, paying for groceries, putting gas in your car, it's not necessarily something that you go do. We tried to correct the situation in that building. It was obviously fell on deaf ears, as I mentioned earlier. So nobody sought legal advice because we did not have the knowledge that we have now that that was a possibility. And to my point before, how important this hearing is for us to be able to help other people so other people know that there is a possibility that you could get an attorney involved. You could get the police involved.
Thank you, Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Chairman,
Let me.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to make an additional comment.
Sorry, sir.
It is my hope that, as this gentlewoman has said, that one of the things that needs to come out of this is, if not the availability of the police, at least that if they do not help you in an HR circumstance, that there are circumstances that people should go to. And I want to thank the gentlewoman for addressing that. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sessions. That is a helpful comment. Now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Brown, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Maloney and Chair Krishnamurti for having this roundtable, and I thank the witnesses for their participation and courage. The NFL has one of the most prominent platforms in the world. Yesterday, America watched the Washington football team's new name unveiling on the Today Show, and in just 10 days, 100 million people are going to tune into the Super Bowl. How the NFL handles the issue of sexual harassment matters. It can shift public discourse for good or bad. In 2014, Commissioner Roger Goodell said, and I quote, "The NFL is held to a higher standard, and properly so, given the league's prominent role in American society." So my question is for Ms. Nunez. Ms. Nunez, what message do you think the NFL has sent, given the way it has handled the investigation of the Washington football team?
That unless you have money, unless you have power, honestly, unless you're white, you're powerless. You don't matter. So I think the message they still have the potential to obviously change what is happening. Because we're still in it, obviously we're still here and pushing. So they definitely have the potential to really do something that truly means to inspire change.
Thank you. So given that the NFL has been pushing a narrative of empowering women that seems convenient to them, does it frustrate you in the light of the NFL's public relations campaign involving women's issues?
100%. I think that, it feels like a slap in the face, specifically for women who have gone through this, and then they're seeing that they're inspiring change, they're putting women in positions of power, yet we're over here saying that's not how it is. And I mean, that's essentially what it seems like, is that this is just a facade that they're putting on the outside. However, on the back end, things are still happening. And that's part of why we want the accountability, because take this as setting the example where if you actually hold Dan Snyder accountable for this, you're setting an example not only for other football teams, but other soccer teams, other leagues, that this kind of behavior is not acceptable.
Thank you. And Ms. Applegate, how can the NFL send the right message about sexual harassment in the workplace?
I believe the first step is to have Roger Goodell also be held accountable, and I believe that in holding Roger Goodell accountable, that means that he should be resigning from his position. As I mentioned in my opening statement, he has proved over and over again that he is unequipped to handle any type of issue within the NFL, social justice, sexual assaults, domestic violence, and now sexual harassment. Beginning with new leadership from the top of the NFL will create change throughout all 32 teams.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. I apologize, Mr. Baker. I forgot to give you a chance to respond. I think there may have been an outstanding question or allegation against you with regard to tweets. Would you like to respond?
I don't recall every single thing that I've tweeted. I will say the dates of some of what she mentioned were many, many years ago. I would say more importantly, nothing that I've done outside of the Washington football team has anything to do with why we're here today. And my story is true. We know that the videos that I saw and we were directed to produce, we know they exist and they were created. And that's what I'm here for, is to tell that story.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baker. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, and I just would like to thank the witnesses for their courage, who have taken the time to share their experiences with us today. First and foremost, let's start off by saying that there is absolutely no excuse for abusive behavior or harassment in any work environment. And any such instances of such behavior should be fully investigated, and the violators should be held accountable. I'm very sorry that the witnesses with us today have had these types of experiences. This committee has been tasked with investigating waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars and ensuring government agencies are operating properly. And to be clear, there are plenty of federal issues within the committee's jurisdiction that deserve our attention also. Inflation is at a 40-year high, energy prices are skyrocketing, and Americans are struggling to heat their homes and pay their electric bills. Veterans are unable to access essential VA benefits due to certain federal agency closures. Even as the number of encountered DHS officials, or even the number of encounters DHS officials have had with illegal border crossings, it topped 2 million since January 2021. This committee refuses to hold an immigration hearing despite multiple calls from Republicans to do so. How long can we continue to ignore the worsening humanitarian crisis the Biden administration refuses to acknowledge? We need to keep in mind that we are here to work for the American people, and I urge you to hold hearings that address all these issues under the committee's jurisdiction. And with that, I thank you and yield back.
Thank you. I'll use your remaining time. As you know, we've been tackling a number of issues on this committee, everything from oversight of various government agencies to oversight of federal contractors to oversight of January 6th to oversight of Afghanistan. And now it's time to talk about workplace safety. Sexual harassment pervades our workplace, unfortunately, even in 2022. NFL and Washington football team are among the most prominent workplaces in America. Everybody watches to see what is happening there, to take cues on what is happening in their own workplace. I respectfully point out that this committee does have jurisdiction with regard to workplace safety. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to not only thank you, but assure you that this is the opening salvo. So don't you worry. There's not that many people here today, but those of us that are here, and even many who are not here, are going to stay on this like glue. I have a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old daughter. My 22-year-old daughter is embarking on the very career path now that you young women described at the outset of your careers, and you put fear in my heart for her and my younger daughter. And so I can assure you that elections have consequences, and the reason it's important to elect women to office is so that these kinds of issues get addressed. That having been said, I want to point out the NFL's showcase event is a week away, as the colleagues have mentioned, and these difficult conversations around racism, discrimination, and accountability cannot be pushed to the sidelines. I'd be remiss not to mention the obvious. The NFL has a sexism and a race problem that it refuses to seriously address. Colin Kaepernick, John Gruden, now Brian Flores. The names change, but the problem remains. There is an egregious lack of representation and opportunity for black leaders in the NFL. But my hometown Miami Dolphins are now the catalyst to this conversation over the lack of diversity among football's coaching and executive ranks, and hopefully this will result in reform. This is a common thread, though, and I have a question, Ms. Coburn, of you. And let me just underscore how this represents the expenditure of taxpayer dollars over which we are supposed to jealously guard in this committee. You might be aware that part of the reason that the NFL is such a profitable business is that Congress approved legislation in 1961 that allowed an antitrust exemption where professional football teams to pool together when negotiating radio and television contracts. They also receive lucrative federal tax exemptions and taxpayer dollars in the hundreds of millions to build football stadiums that make them billions. Do you believe Congress should be in the business of protecting an organization that puts the interests of billionaire owners above hundreds of women who experienced harassment and abuse? And do you think that those benefits, that we should consider revoking them if they do not make changes to ensure that you have protections when it comes to human resources, sexual assault, accountability, making sure that there is an equitable and safe workplace for their employees?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And the NFL recently had a $110 billion media deal, from what I understand. So that amount of money came directly from the exemptions that are in place thanks to you. I think that the oversight of the NFL needs to stand within you because there's no one else doing it. Yeah, the money and power is what rules the NFL. And unless somebody steps in and holds them accountable, nothing will change. They will continue business as usual.
I trust that in the future, Mr. Chairman, we will have far more than 3 minutes apiece, and far more time will be devoted by this committee on the leadership of Chairwoman Maloney to ensure that we hold the NFL accountable and that we help you seek justice. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm with Ms. Wasserman Schultz. I wish we each had more than 3 minutes to discuss these important issues. I'm grateful to all the witnesses for coming. It's awfully difficult to sit here and listen to the horrific circumstances to which you were subjected. And I want you each to know that I've read each one of your statements. I've also went and read multiple articles about the situation in preparation for this hearing. And I want you to know that I'm really greatly moved by your testimony, and this view what we've heard today is abhorrent and disgusting. And I would also suggest, Mr. Chairman, I know our chairwoman's not here, but this is really an unusual investigation that we're engaged in. I would encourage, Mr. Chairman, that maybe we look at other examples of this workplace environment that is toxic in this way. And I would suggest we bring in Mr. Zucker from CNN, maybe Chris Cuomo, maybe the producers that have problems. I think we need to expand this. And every one of these victim witnesses who testified today, and in their written report, their statements, all of them said that one thing that is important here is to spread this out to try to end this in multiple venues. And I think that's right. And I would just, before I get to my questions, 3 minutes doesn't give you much time. There are four things that are available to a victim right now, and that's administrative procedures, civil procedures, if there's a criminal conduct, and some of these that I read about looked to me like they involved criminal conduct. So there's criminal procedure, and then there is what I would say is happening today, and that's public pressure. and public awareness. And so I thank each of the witnesses for being here. Ms. Colburn, it is my understanding that the Washington football team has new priorities to protect the cheerleading team. Some of these measures include better access to human resources, assignment of an HR employee to the cheerleading team, and now it's called the dance team. Is that enough to protect cheerleaders from a toxic workplace culture?
Not when leadership has not changed. And one of the men who was very closely involved with the cheerleaders, their auditions, their calendar pictures, the videos that were created at the behest of that person, no, I don't believe they're safe.
Thank you. I think you're probably right. I wish we had more time. My time has expired. I hope next time, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to engage in this, that we get back to a 5-minute rule at least. And
Sure.
with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. I would just point out everyone seems to have been fired except the owner in this particular situation. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 3 minutes.
He wasn't here at the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for coming forward today. Your courage and your resiliency have demonstrated so much to so many. Experiencing workplace harassment as young professional women in a male-dominated profession and to see it go largely unchecked is dispiriting, but coming forward and publicly sharing your stories is cathartic, and I'm confident that your bravery will help countless women and men down the road and usher in an era of greater gender equality. Ms. Coburn, in your op-ed, you mentioned that after the secret Good Bits videos hit the news, that you and 40 or so other cheerleader alumni came together and some of you were able to mediate a settlement. Were those who settled, were they barred from going to court because of a forced arbitration agreement? Do you know?
Yes, when those videos were uncovered, that's when I came out publicly. I had the strength and courage to organize them, and yes, they got together, and there was mediation, and there was a settlement, and along with that settlement, they were forced to sign NDAs. To be honest, many of them wish they hadn't. They wish they could have spoken out. They were very vocal before the process began, but they also wanted to squash these videos. Their mothers, their daughters, their businesswomen, and they just wanted those videos to go away. So they settled and signed NDAs, but I'd like to remind you, and that's why I'm here, that those videos were created at the behest of the owner, and that is a criminal offense.
Whatever has happened to those videos, have they been destroyed? Has there been any talk about disposition of those videos?
I'm not sure. I've been told by people involved that they were told that they were told to destroy it. I think the Post had copies, but I'm not quite sure where they are. But I have a feeling there's many copies in possession of many of Dan Snyder's friends, if I had to guess. Along with other...
So tell me this, Ms. Coburn, the fact that the NFL under Roger Goodell is covering up the report that was issued pursuant to the investigation, how does this help to perpetuate the good old boy network that engages in sexual discrimination, in sexual harassment, in racial discrimination, racial harassment? How does that impact where we are today with the NFL?
It sends quite a clear message that money and power can buy anything, and that they can get away with anything, and they did.
Well, I thank you for your courage in coming forward, organizing these women, and I hope that you continue to stick with it. We will stick with you, and we will do what Congress can to make sure that we root out this kind of misconduct and not let it continue to perpetuate. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, courageous women, for coming forward.
I want to apologize for some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who were first saying thank you for your courage and then victim blaming you. Like somehow you should go to the Human Resources Department that didn't even exist. When you did go to someone superior to you to complain, you were told to shut up and never repeat it. So let's be very clear. Now, there was also this question, what can Congress do about this? Well, Congress can do a lot about this. Next week, all of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who aren't here now could vote for the bill by Sherry Bustos that is going to require that no NDAs can be forced upon employees for sexual harassment or sexual assault. That would go a long way. We could also investigate the tax-exempt status of the National Football League. We gave them that tax-exempt status. Evidently, there was $8 billion received last year that was then divided up among the various teams to the tune of about $250 million a team. Oh, how clever is that? How about if the taxpayers had received that money because the NFL isn't doing its job? Roger Goodell has to release the report. There are 120 victims that came forward and testified. The Beth Wilkinson report must be released. And we need to take a real good look at the NFL and determine whether or not it's really eligible for tax-exempt status. Now, let me ask each of you this question. How many times were you sexually harassed when you were working at the Washington Redskins whatever they're called now, Commanders, I guess?
Are you asking
I'm going to start with you, Ms. Coburn.
Too many to count. I was there 14 years, and it's too many to count.
Is it more than 100?
It's more than 100.
More than 200?
If I had to guess, yes. These comments, these sexual objectification comments, these uncomfortable situations. I was arm candy at events with all the male executives. Like, it was a very constant thing.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
At least 50 to 100. And it wasn't even just the comments, it was the situations of being tossed in the air with a skirt on and me having to convince myself, keep your legs closed to avoid an uncomfortable situation in front of the potential client.
All right. Ms. Flores?
Over 100.
Ms. Applegate?
I worked there for a year and a half, so mathematically that would be roughly 515 times because it happened on a daily basis, and that was a 7-day-a-week job.
All right, Singleton.
I echo what Emily said. It happened every single day that you were on site. It didn't matter where you were. It was a pervasive culture that happened, and I worked there for 8 years. So multiply that 500 times by 8.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. This was a predatory environment. I don't believe it's just going on at the Washington Commanders. This is a message to send to every football team in this country. And the criminal conduct that appears to have gone on at the Washington Commanders needs to be fully investigated. That video must be found, and it must be reviewed, and criminal action should be considered by the local district attorney or U.S. attorney. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the witnesses, I was actually in my office listening to your testimony very intently, what you had to deal with and what you were pressured into doing, what you were coerced into experiencing is abhorrent behavior. It's never tolerated anywhere. It should not be tolerated at any workplace in the United States. And I think that this body, with respect to sexual harassment, has done a lot of work over the years to make it expressly clear to employers that sexual harassment and sexual misconduct is not to be tolerated in the United States. I think that the report in question by the NFL should be released. I'm a fan of the product, but it is clear that there are several issues with the NFL, this being one of them. And I think that that report should be released. I think the other thing that it is important, and you've heard it, obviously from my side of the aisle, is that is it Congress's purview to quote unquote do something? I don't want to use hyperbole in this instance because what we're discussing is incredibly serious and incredibly sensitive. But Congress also has to be very careful about its role, not just with the Washington Redskins. I still call them the Redskins. I know they changed their name, but to me, it's always going to be the Redskins. It's not whether it's with the Washington Redskins or with any corporation in particular. We have a responsibility here of regulating specifically the United States economy when it comes to interstate commerce, to regulating our borders, to actually making sure we coin sound money, that we appropriate for the necessary functions of government. But one of the things that the Constitution of these United States actually precludes us from doing is interfering directly in the affairs of individual businesses, no matter how abhorrent they may be. Now, if there's criminality involved, then that is where the justice system, specifically in this case, the civil system, takes those matters. But I think for my colleagues, no matter how you feel about this issue, and I feel terrible for you and what has happened in the culture at the Washington Redskins, we have to make sure that we don't become the arbiters of deciding how these things are going to be handled inside individual institutions. If there was going to be a committee where these accusations were actually going to be handled, if you want to take a look at what federal law might be, it actually wouldn't be this committee. It would be the committee that meets next door, Judiciary, or maybe Education and Labor, that actually deals with labor practices. And so I really wanted to come down here to express both sides of a very terrible issue. One, the report should be made public. The NFL should absolutely do that. But two, just as well, and this is much more for my colleagues and frankly not for the witnesses, is that we have to be careful about how we wield the power of Congress. Because if Congress decides that they're going to engage themselves in the actions of every business or every community, regardless of whatever our powers actually are under the United States Constitution, then we actually limit the authority of Congress, and we actually undo the authority that we are here to actually wield under the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy. I would like to thank all our witnesses for being here today. No one should ever have to be employed in a toxic work environment. More importantly, sexual harassment is a behavior that our society has determined is antithetical to a professional work environment. No one should ever have to face that either at work or elsewhere. And I appreciate the courage it took to tell your stories, and I hope you're able to find peace and healing. While I appreciate the opportunity to hear these stories, I would remind the majority that sexual harassment has been illegal for decades and that Congress is not the proper forum for legal relief. We are legislative in nature, and this hearing should be held in a courtroom, not in this committee room. It seems like this committee, the Committee on Oversight and Reform, enjoys holding hearings on issues over which we have no jurisdiction. As I said before, I will say again, this committee used to be named the Committee on Government Oversight and Reform, and when the majority chose to remove government from this committee's title, it should have been a giant red flag that House Democrats believe their authorities go beyond the four corners of the Constitution and the jurisdiction and charter of this committee. This committee needs to refocus its priorities on investigating government operations, not the dealings of private companies and organizations. When private companies or individuals break the law, bringing them to justice is the responsibility of the executive branch. But perhaps that is why this executive branch issue is being highlighted in the legislative branch. This must be a signal to the nation that the executive branch under President Joe Biden is not faithfully enforcing the law as required by Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which says he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It must be evident that this is not happening and that the President, through the executive branch, is not faithfully executing the law. Our nation is currently facing record numbers of illegal immigrants crossing our southern border. Inflation is at a 40-year high, tensions are rising with Russia, and we have a real potential of another war in Europe. We have an opioid epidemic where in the last year alone we've had over 100,000 people die of drug overdoses, with the vast majority coming from opioids. Our supply chain continues to have major disruptions, and we have experienced countless other crises spurred on by the current administration's failed policies. And yet we have not held a single hearing to do actual oversight of the federal government, which is the job of this committee. oversight of the executive branch. The mission of this committee is to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse of the federal government, not to investigate the inner dealings of a private entity, regardless of how atrocious. I urge the chairwoman and chairman to concentrate this committee's energy and time to dealing with the many crises our nation is currently facing and no longer abdicate its responsibilities as it has time and time again done this past year. Thank you, and I yield back.
Hold on. Thank you, Mr. Clyde. We're gonna wrap up, but I have a couple questions for you. In June 2018, the NFL announced the findings of its investigations into Carolina Panthers owner Jerry Richardson. The investigation substantiated allegations of workplace sexual harassment and racial discrimination, and the use of non-disclosure agreements, also known as NDAs, to silence former employees. These allegations were revealed only after the victims went public with their stories. Can you put the recommendations that the NFL received? Very good. The NFL's announcement included several recommendations to strengthen its protection of workers in teams across the league. This is back in 2018. One recommendation was, quote, a specific prohibition of using NDAs to limit reporting of potential violations or cooperation in league investigations under the personal conduct policy. Ms. Engelson, you left the Washington football team in 2019 after the NFL issued its recommendations. Were you aware of a requirement that misconduct in the workplace should be reported to the NFL?
No, I was not.
Ms. Nunez, you also left the Washington football team that same year in 2019, so after the recommendations were made, after the Carolina Panthers investigation. When you left the team, were you asked to sign an NDA?
To my knowledge, I signed release papers.
Another recommendation was, quote, a specific requirement that claims of workplace misconduct issues be reported to the league office under the personal conduct policy. Ms. Engelson, were you aware of this policy?
No, I was not aware of this policy. It was not disseminated at all in the Washington football team.
Finally, the NFL was recommended to, and I quote, establish a hotline or other system to allow league and club employees to report issues of workplace misconduct on a confidential basis. Ms. Nunez, were you aware of such a hotline or system to report issues of workplace conduct on a confidential basis?
I was not.
So this has been a past issue, and it's a current issue. It is no surprise that you were not aware of these reporting mechanisms because it appears that the NFL failed to implement them. 3 years later, history is already repeating itself. After the NFL's investigation of WFT, the NFL stated that it would implement, and I quote, a requirement that all club employees have the ability anonymously to report issues of workplace conduct to their club or the NFL. The NFL holds itself to a higher standard, yet it has repeatedly shirked its responsibility to keep workers safe. It is up to Congress to get to the bottom of why. Let me just repeat. The NFL released reports on Ray Rice, the Carolina Panthers, Deflategate, but nothing with regard to the Washington football team sexual harassment scandal. Now, I just want to make a few final comments here. Some of my colleagues have repeatedly acknowledged your pain. They've said that you have suffered horrific harm. But unfortunately, they say that workplace misconduct in this committee being examined is a big waste of time. That the issue of sexual harassment in one of the most prominent workplaces in this country and a cover-up on behalf of a powerful owner is simply not worth congressional oversight is absolutely wrong. The issue of sexual harassment is absolutely within the purview of this committee. And I'm so grateful for you coming here and sharing your stories again. And it's very painful. Obviously, you've provided very emotional testimony, and many of us were moved to just hearing it. I want to just say finally, today we've heard repeatedly of sexual harassment, not just from employees, not just from middle management, but we've heard about sexual harassment by Dan Snyder, the team owner himself. And anyone who saw the Washington Commanders announcement of the team name yesterday saw that he was part of the decision-making with regard to that particular issue as well. He is front and center in the decision-making of that team, even today, despite having presided over pervasive sexual harassment and committed sexual harassment against Ms. Johnston and others himself. Ms. Johnston shared how Dan Snyder himself sexually touched her without her consent at a work dinner and then tried to push her into his limo. Ms. Coburn told us how Dan Snyder ogled at cheerleaders through binoculars during auditions and used women as, quote, sex objects and tools to increase sales. Ms. Applegate's boss told her not to wear flats because he, quote, liked the way her body looked better in high heels. Ms. Engelson's harasser humiliated her regularly at marketing meetings. Ms. Nunez' older colleague texted her suggestively about the, quote, things he would do to her. I'm so sorry you endured all this. And that's just a sampling of the outrageous behavior we heard today. And when these women reported their harassment time and again, they were almost always ignored or told to just shut up. In fact, there was no functional HR department and no system for reporting sexual harassment at WFT. And as Ms. Engelson told you, when the team finally hired executives who tried to protect employees from harassment, those executives were quickly fired. Neither the WFT nor the NFL ever did anything to protect these women, despite NFL supposedly holding itself to a, quote, higher standard. And that's why we stepped in, to protect these victims, to protect victims all across the country, and to hold the rich and powerful accountable. And as I said earlier, today is the beginning, not the end. Today is when we start holding WFT and NFL accountable for the harassment, accountable for the cover-ups. The buck stops here. Okay, we have one last person who just showed up for questions. Ms. Tlaib, are you there? Ms. Tlaib? I'm not sure if she can hear me or she's, perhaps she's not here. Okay, well, I just want to. This is a bipartisan issue, the investigation of sports. In 2005, Republican Chairman Tom Davis of this committee, joined by Democrats, subpoenaed Major League Baseball about its steroid safety policy. 10 years ago, Democrats and Republicans on this committee again worked together to demand that the NFL test its players for steroids. In 2012, then Chairman Issa held a hearing on this issue, stating that the NFL's failure to safeguard its players' health regarding steroids was not just an issue affecting the league, it, quote, endangers young athletes who admire and often try to emulate them. And let me just emphasize that our sons, our daughters, everybody, they're watching what the NFL does, and they take their cues from the NFL, and they take their cues from how the league treats misconduct that happens in the NFL. The NFL has an enormous platform. When necessary to inform potential legislation, Democrats and Republicans work together, and that's what I hope we will do once again with regard to sexual harassment in the workplace. The failure to do so far has endangered women across the NFL and sent a powerful message to every workplace that accountability is not mandatory, but it's optional. I ask my Republican colleagues to join in demanding that the NFL do better. With that, I want to thank the participants again for your bravery and courage in coming forward today. And I commit to you that today is the beginning, not the end. And with that, this roundtable briefing is adjourned.